Friends, good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Sounds like I'm pretty amplified. That's great. It's such a pleasure to see a full house here this afternoon. T.S. Eliot definitely had it right, at least in academic circles, that April is indeed the coolest month. So we really appreciate your taking some time out to join us for what I know is going to be a really exciting talk. I'm thrilled to pieces that we're able to bring this event off today. So I'm going to introduce our introducer after I welcome you. So I'm Phil Harling, the director of the Center for the Humanities here at UM. There's music playing. And I'm here to welcome you to the Edith Bleich lecture series, the 23-24 academic year edition of a lecture series that's been around for a while now. Memory of Edith Bleich. Ms. Bleich was one of UM's earliest and most devoted students. And each year the center invites a humanities scholar to speak to the UM community about their research. Oh, it's quiet now. Yeah, okay, that's great. Now, Professor Brenna Monroe of the UM Department of English was one of the three nominators for this year's speaker, along with Krista Goff in history and Greg Koger of political science and the Hanley Democracy Center. And so I want to introduce Brenna to introduce our speaker. Brenna specializes in queer and post-colonial studies, Anglophone African literature, and queer global writing and cinema. She serves on the editorial board of Safundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies, and she's the author of numerous articles and book chapters, in addition to the book, South Africa and the Dream of Love to Come, Queer Sexuality and the Struggle for Freedom, University of Minnesota Press 2013, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist in LGBT studies. Brenna is currently working on the politics of sexuality in contemporary writing from Nigeria and its diaspora. Do you need some help with I don't know what's going on with the music here. Do you want to check it out before Brenna comes up? I mean, it was fun for a minute, but maybe not for the whole talk. Is it me?
It's you.
Oh, no. This just goes to show that you should never put a cell phone in your back pocket. I'm putting it up here and I'm deconditioning it for the rest of the talk. I'm so sorry. Physician, heal thyself.
Well, then it's easily solved. So, thank you all for being here, and to the Center for the Humanities for making this event possible. Jennifer Evans is Professor of History at Carleton University in Canada. Her work ranges widely across histories of sexuality, the modern history of Germany and East Central Europe, and the longue durée history of authoritarianism, populism, and fascism. But she also works on art, sound, and memory, and the role of photography and social media as agents of historical meaning. Evans is an extraordinarily prolific and dynamic scholar. She's the author most recently of Queer Life After Fascism, Kinship and the Queer Art of History, and of Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin. She has also co-authored Queer Cities, Queer Cultures, Europe since 1945, and The Ethics of Seeing, Photography and 20th Century German History. She has edited a special issue of German History on queering German history and co-wrote Holocaust Memory in the Digital Mediascape. She has won numerous research grants, including an SHRC grant titled Hate 2.0, Combating Right-Wing Extremism in the Age of Social Technology, and another on Populist Publics, Memory, Populism, and Misinformation in the Canadian Social Mediascape. Her public-facing work includes publications in The Washington Post, The Guardian, The National Post, The Globe and Mail, and The Conversation. And she has also been a moving force in the collaborative digital project, The New Fascism Syllabus, which I highly recommend people check out. Her work on the legacies of fascism in the contemporary moment and how histories are repurposed in the present is a necessary resource at this time and place, as transgender and gender diverse people have come under intense political attack, in forms that echo how same-sex loving people were targeted in a previous era, an era many of us lived through, but that has become itself a much contested past. Even as what's happening now is new, including what I'm now understanding from reading some of Jennifer's book as a sort of broken kinship with one form of feminism. So please welcome Professor Evans.
Thank you. I'm almost missing the music. It was actually it was kind of a nice accompaniment. No, well, thank you. I mean, look at this crowd. This is really, really humbling, and I'm very grateful to have been invited here and welcomed in the way that I have been. And I have a couple of folks that I'd like to thank before we get started to make sure that people understand how meaningful that is for me as a scholar. And of course, my thanks go out to Dr. Phil Harling, to Christina Larson, to Oni Dunham for helping arrange all of this, the work that goes into bringing people from far away and hosting them. It was so lovely to have lunch with Brenna and the graduate students today. I always learn so much listening to students, and I take those conversations back with me to Carleton, and I pass them along to my colleagues and my fellow students. I'm honored to be a guest on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Seminole tribe of Florida. As a settler in a colonial space, this experience of living through genocide has fundamentally shaped the way that I do my work, not just in recent years, and it really has seeped into even my writing in German history, in trying to think about possibilities of solidarity and world building in a period that we in Canada think of as reconciliation. And it's a long and moving and evolving conversation that we're trying to have. And so you'll hear bits and pieces, I think, of my positionality in my work today and what I'm going to present to you. And we're going to check out the tech and see if things are working perfectly. All right, so in my talk this afternoon, and it's both in the form and its content, it's at once a history of trans-inclusive queer solidarities and entanglements in the second half of the 20th century, and it's something that we in the German sphere call a plaidoyer, an appeal to conceptualize and write the history of sexuality differently, more creatively, more subjectively, in kinship with the past that we seek to uncover. Fundamentally, it's an effort to conceptualize how we might write histories that are not always our own, mindfully and with purpose, and to find a language and a method to steer us through the turbulent times we find ourselves in today, where we seem to have lost touch with histories of solidarity and working through, which were not always perfect, but also formed part of the queer history of the past half-century. While some of these histories have increasingly trickled into the mainstream, influencing policy at the highest level, it bears asking about the strengths and weaknesses, the losses, as well as the gains of the liberal democratic project of the late 20th century. And to quote from one of my favorite British scholars of sexuality, Geoffrey Weeks, "The world we have won," or rather, all that we believed ourselves to have won, which seems right now so much in peril. In other words, what I'm going to do today is give an illustration drawing from Germany on how we might think about queer and trans love, loss, solidarity, and struggle together, both intersectionally and across difference, as an appeal to think and write and relate differently to the queer past as a way to build a way towards a more equitable future. But before I begin, a quick mention that one of the interesting things about this field of queer studies is the enormous footprint of queer and trans work in the Anglo-American sphere, and I'll add Canadian as well, in universities and in community spaces, versus, say, in Germany, which might be surprising to you. In this slide, we see several of the recent texts in queer history that have surfaced these last years and with which my own book is in conversation. In many parts of North America, especially, queer theory and queer and trans history is alive and thriving, with tenured positions, long-term research partnerships, and students like my own, Noah Bordeaux, awarded fellowships for trans history at the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum. In Germany, where there has been some progress with a recent prize that I won, named after a post-war chancellor who actually was one of the most rabid in persecuting homosexuals after 45. So there's an irony in the fact that the Humboldt Foundation gave me a prize named after Konrad Adenauer, given the work that I do. So we can always talk about that if we want. But there's been a major lag in Germany in terms of how queer and trans studies has been taken up by the university, despite several dissertations in the pipeline, and also very important exhibitions that we see in various parts of Germany, not just in Berlin. So there's an interest, and there's a need, and there's a desire, and yet there's only one professor with a named chair who actually does this kind of work in history. And this is worth thinking about, especially in a place like Germany, where we've seen and will hear there were great gains made, but where there too, almost every day, government ministers, not just on the far right, and sometimes teamed up with former athletes, which is a strange kind of thing, find their way to a microphone in order to denounce or call into question the lives and lifestyles of those undermining the status quo. So another point to keep in mind is, how might a more intersectional history of queer and trans lives provide us with the tools and capacities to fight what is certain to be a pitched battle on this long road we all have ahead of us? So to get at these questions, we need to think methodologically as much as empirically about how we construct our histories. Because as you'll soon see, one of my arguments is that the way we have framed our studies of the past has limited what and whose stories we in fact see. So to ensure we're on the same page or on the same footing, let me give you a sense of who I am as an historian and how I've kind of come to some of these realizations and where that has taken me in my own work. I began as a historian of sexuality and worked primarily, like many of us do, with police and court records, law codes, newspaper accounts, photographs and memoirs, and I wrote a human geography of placemaking in World War II Berlin that looked at how police, welfare workers, and everyday people helped create Reconstruction East and West Berlin out of a series of social and emotional attachments to the traditional family, while policing those who didn't quite fit this model. My colleague Paul Betts has called Reconstruction recently Europe's civilizing mission turned inward, which as a phrasing gives you a good sense of the stakes and maybe some of the blind spots around European history, post-45 European history, that we're going to circle back to a little bit today. My early work was always meant to be experimental. I wanted to write the histories of straight and same-sex sexuality together in a single volume, to show how central the reconstruction of the family was to East and West Germany. I turned to photography, to storytelling, and to narration to immerse my reader in the emotional landscape that was post-war Berlin. I wanted to encourage them to look, to listen, and to feel the scale of violence, the desperation for recovery, what Tina Kempt would go on to describe as a method that encourages sensorial engagement, to draw out the historical and affective backgrounds and foregrounds of images and texts for what this might tell us about marginalized people. And I love this photo for the way it kind of captures the argument around those complicated feelings of nostalgia, of violence, of loss, and of rebuilding. As Berkeley's Stefan Ludwig Hoffmann has argued, with the scale of destruction, the Allies came to change how they viewed German perpetrators in the post-war period. I wanted to create in my reader a similar sense of embodied witnessing, to bring to life the emotions of the time, by reading the bread and butter sources of the history of regulation, not just against the grain, but in an entirely new way, drawing out the affective and performative features of eyewitness accounts and historicizing health records, police investigation reports, and vernacular and stylized photographs for creating changing ways of seeing and feeling the history of the Cold War. And this is just a really great example of stylized photos of the post-war period in East and West Berlin, or the eastern and western parts of Berlin, and how you can see the sort of images of the family being so central to both nations, what would become two nations, in the aftermath of the war. It was here that I began to develop an interest in the role of the aesthetics of political claims making, or how we might look to everyday life, to art, and especially to photography as critical sites in the negotiation of citizenship and belonging. So instead of looking at sexual citizenship through the lens of social welfare and policing as built off of T.H. Marshall's work, I wanted to understand rights and privileges in more personal, intimate terms, through changes in subjectivity, affect, and collective affinities, to see beyond dichotomous arguments around whose identities were celebrated and promoted by the state, and which ones were policed as the target of reform. This meant looking to artistic creation, to film, and to photography, and it also required a different set of methods to decipher how these sources worked. Unbeknownst to me, I was thinking through what it would mean to write the history of the post-war period as a queer art of history. Imagining transgression in this way means thinking about the specific ways in which different sources create meaning in their own right. For photography, this means taking seriously an image's agentic quality, if we follow visual anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards as an example. When we look for how photos prick us to think of Roland Barthes' characterization in Camera Lucida, how they force a reaction from us. We can historicize these interactions when we trace the social life of an image from a private photo album to a gallery space. These travels and the relationships they call into being tell us about the changing social, cultural, emotional, and political dynamics at work in different historical moments. To use the example of the photography of Herbert Tobias, whose Manfred photo I have written about in the book and also in an earlier article, it means asking how an image moves from gay subculture as a document of a fleeting sexual encounter to high art, the subject of a retrospective at the Berlinische Galerie in 2009. And how does that reflect changing social, emotional, political values around same-sex sexuality's place in the public sphere? Questions like these set me on a path towards the changing optics of sex and queer and later trans sociability in the late 20th century. I had come to feel that there was a pattern in how historians of sexuality did their work. In the shadow of George Chauncey's famous Gay New York and then Matt Holbrook's Queer London, we were all, including me, writing city stories that told the history of homophobia and resistance in similar ways. As moving from shame to pride, mostly focused on men, and in the German context, looking chiefly at the coercive power of the state, whether in the Nazi period or the Cold War, and how people either blunted or succumbed to regulation. I wondered, what might photography open up, not just in terms of new lines of questioning, but might it show us new temporalities and pivot points? And most importantly, might it show us new subjects of inquiry? I stumbled on a whole series of cruising photos of male prostitutes, also by Herbert Tobias, and I wondered, why haven't we written about this? What do photographs like these tell us about parts of the gay scene that sit awkwardly and maybe uncomfortably next to New Left filmmaker and activist Rosa von Braunheim's filmic ode to gay liberation from 1971, with the huge title, because it's a German title translated into English, "It's not the homosexual that's perverse, but the situation in which he lives." The film demanded that queers stop wasting their time cruising and take to the streets. When I dug a little deeper, I found that there were massive tensions within the West German gay rights movement around subcultural practices, not just among the homophile activists of a generation before, whose explicit aim was assimilation, but also among gay liberation groups of the 70s and 80s. Political activity rested on a denial or disavowal of gender nonconformity, of excessive desire, of cruising, and the streets. And it's not just to say that this was a German thing, right? Think of the most famous moment after Stonewall, when gays and lesbians in New York City shouted down the Puerto Rican-American drag queen, trans woman, and sex worker Sylvia Rivera, effectively saying people like her did not have a place in the movement. Suddenly, it was clear to me. We've let certain parts of the gay rights movement write its own history and later commemorate it through memorial initiatives that look back to this period in a sometimes anodyne and uncomplicated way. It's a similar story when we take sexuality as the frame into the queer past. Although we've seen in the work of my colleagues Katie Sutton, Rainer Herrn, Lori Marhofer, that interwar German sexology helped provide a language for understanding transsexuality in a human way and mobilize in opposition to the anti-sodomy laws, there were still huge challenges within sexological formulations around race, as Marhofer and Heike Bauer have shown in their own work. To say nothing of the fact that, as Howard Chang has argued for East Asia, sexology cemented trans lives as existing on a linear plane of transition instead of emphasizing a spectrum of possibilities, what he calls a transtopia. Viewing trans bodies solely through the lens of medical transition, beginning with gender dysphoria and ending with hormones and medical intervention, Jonah Gard has argued, is a kind of hormonal time, limiting how we understand trans people in the past as always en route to some utopian place of contentment and legibility within a more authentic self in the present. This trans temporality not only reproduces strict heteronormative gender binaries of before and after, but it presumes a linear, progressive, and common set of experiences. I wondered, how might photography intervene in this, keep the aperture open, as it were? How might it allow us to see a broader range of affinities, kinships, entanglements, and life courses? I asked, in other words, what might artistic production reveal about other parts of the gay, lesbian, and trans scenes, including other possible subjectivities, associations, communities, turning points, and ways of life than those produced by the state, by sexology, by social movements of the post-1970s era, that the historiography lauds as having ushered in acceptance and the expansion of rights in the last part of the 20th century. So to illustrate this point, let's linger for a moment over this incredible photo of Cheyenne. This is a photograph taken in 1996 at a bar in the district of Kreuzberg in Berlin called colloquially SO36. So the area of town in Kreuzberg is called SO36, and the bar itself is called SO36. And if you look on Cheyenne's awesomely bedazzled top, you can also see the name of the space. So if this were an undergraduate lecture, I would then open things up and ask you what you see in this image, what you think is amazing in this image. But since it's a formal talk, I'm going to just command the space and not let you to say anything, but tell you what you're thinking. And you can tell me later if I was far off. My students would look at this and they'd say, this is not German history as we think of it, right? This is not the German history we imagine. And I would say absolutely that this is the German history of the post-45 period, but it's not always the one we land on because the histories of queer and trans of color experience is not so well known, it's not so well researched in an academic space. They'd ask why that's the case. And I'd say that with the exception, again, of one professor at the Free University of Berlin, Martin Lücke, this history is not positioned within the academy. It is, however, being done and being researched in community. Thanks to it's the domain of amazing activist scholars who do the bulk of this work that we know of this. And finally, I'd also say it hasn't really entered into sort of public consciousness because the bulk of research that does exist focuses understandably on the Nazi period and in the immediate post-war period, that has been the focus of attention, on gay men mostly, on legal and medical turning points, and on social movements. Only recently has research entered even into the 1970s and 80s. Students might ask where this photo was taken. And I'd mentioned that what we do know is that it was in a bar that is home in the early 1990s onwards to migrant queer communities who regularly host dance parties. You can still go, by the way, if you go to Berlin. It's a plug for the dance parties. Known as Gayhana, which features Homo-Oriental music, a mix of Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew music for a lesbian, gay, non-binary, and trans audience, often spun by DJ Ipek, seen here on the left. SO36 is also home to black gay nights where queers of color have carved out a space for themselves in the city. In other words, this photo of Cheyenne speaks to the existence of a larger intersectional audience, emblematic of a post-migrant Germany. That it was home, too, to drag parties like this one, captured by photographer Nihad Nino Pusia, who himself fled war-torn Yugoslavia for Berlin, where he takes photos of queer, trans, Roma, and Sinti communities to humanize and destigmatize them, again, shows the intersectional and transnational kinships and struggles that come together in a space like this. So I asked Nino if he knew who Cheyenne was, and he said that she worked in a bakery by day and was originally from, shout out, Brazil, part of the Tunta or Sissy scene. It's a kind of a very special drag scene in 1990s Berlin. I then learned last summer, talking to another friend of mine, Ruby, also from Brazil. It's interesting. Brazil has this very big pull on me right now. That Cheyenne at one point made their way back to Brazil and is still performing drag there. This photo was taken up as part of an exhibition in the Schwules Museum in 2020 and is now featured both in my talk with you today and in my book, suggesting that it too has moved from spaces of subculture out into community and into academic settings, which tells you again that there is some legitimacy to these questions in places like Canada, in the US, in parts, in the UK, versus in Germany, where this has not necessarily been the case. What about this photo of Johnny Kingsize on the left, a member of the early 2000s drag king group Kings of Berlin, photographed by Annette Frick, who made a career photographing punks and queers. Frick is keen to document self-presentation, how people construct themselves in a public capacity, and her work is bound up with the fluidity of identity, body, sex, and gender. Frick thrives on the tensions between Johnny's presentation as butch or perhaps as transmasculine and the language on their arms in Johnny's own words. I have never defined myself as a lesbian butch or anything yet, but being a drag king was only partially playful for me. Johnny goes on to see drag as an essential step towards my life as a trans something, as a trans man. Like trans film scholar Eliza Steinbach's notion of cinema's shimmering images that defy the rigidity of gender binaries and identity, photography has that capacity to blur fixed and firm boundaries, allowing us to see diversity in its multiple forms. Others have used photography as part of this narration of the self. In East Germany, Nadja Schallenberg, seen in the small photograph center left, fashioned this self-portrait as part of her coming out album, which she gifted to her family for Christmas. I love that. In it, she assembled photos and poems and correspondence and newspaper clippings to help communicate her sense of self as what she called a lestra, a lesbian transsexual, which was a bit of a mix of androgyny and punk. Schallenberg helped establish the transsexual counseling service at the Sonntagsclub, an East German gay and lesbian mutual aid center, where she worked to bring folks to the table from gay, lesbian, trans circles to gather in each other's differences and find a common ground. Photography and life writing gave Nadia, like Nora Eckert next to her on the slide, who worked at the nightclub Café Hug in West Berlin and documented her own life through images, the tools to better understand themselves, leaving a record that might also lead other queer and trans persons to the spaces and places of love, compassion, self-help, and kinship with those in their midst. Photography also highlights some of the tensions within feminist and lesbian and trans scene and among historians seeking to understand these worlds. While the transsexual Charlotte von Malsdorf, her words, is well known in Germany, and maybe to us in North America after the success of the Broadway adaptation of her memoir, I Am My Own Wife, and she's in the middle here between the two gents and the awesome 70s mustache on the right. Bring that back. I want to talk about this photo on the far right for a second. Some photo collections from the former GDR employed the conventions of studio and portrait photography to try and reframe queer and trans relationships from heteronormative imaginings. In Love in the Time of Communism, Josie McClellan discusses the stunning couples photo of Rita Thomas and her partner Heli, together with their two very well-groomed dogs. Now you need to know that Rita Thomas is a dog groomer in East Germany, and you can see it on their amazing poodles here. So from the age of 15, Thomas adopted the nickname Tommy. She stands behind her partner, dressed in a vest and cravat, sporting a coiffed hairstyle commonly found among mods at the time. Were we to focus solely on the studio shot and not on the other myriad images in the Thomas collection, we would have to concede that its staging of a relationship seems rather conventional. Taken alongside her stated biography, featured in the 2003 Schwules Museum or Gay and Lesbian Museum exhibition, right in the middle, Gay Women and Men in Berlin, 1945 to 1969, it speaks to the long-term love and partnership of these two women, who over the years built a business, had a vibrant social life, and became politically active in the early East German gay rights movement, which, unlike Across the Wall, actually involved women as well. But to stop there forecloses other points of entry into the world of non-normative gender identification, kinship across difference, and sexual expression that likewise animated Tommy's world. As we see in this photo, Tommy is dressed in drag with friends for Fasching, for Carnival. She performed in cross-dressing performances with the activist cabaret group Hibaret, and by all accounts, she held wild parties in her house, and as Andrea Rothman shows in her brilliant new book on Berlin, she and Heli frequented all manner of establishments with women who likewise flouted conventional portrayals of femininity. When we view Tommy's photographs as evidence of lesbian subjectivity, we gain access to the world of alternative female friendships and intimacies and same-sex desire among cis and alternatively gendered women, a world frequently written out of the LGBTQI life and experience. But if we view these photographs simply as a reflection of static, transparent, and bounded identity categories, we neglect the complex web of experiences and subjectivities that not only may have changed across time, as languages for self-actualization have and do, but we similarly discount the possibility of polyvalent lives percolating in and around Tommy's community itself. In other words, as Jack Halberstam has argued, in order to be in a position to recognize the insufficiencies of fixed and firm identity categories, we need to think in new and different ways about what it means to claim a body. At the same time that Tommy's visual archive is absolutely essential in addressing what is missing in the historical record in terms of female same-sex community and desire, without what Katie Sutton calls an ethics of attentiveness to protocols we might use to imagine the possibility that transmasculine and transfeminine bodies also intermixed in this story, we disregard the possibility of trans realities that may have resided beyond the frame. What this kind of reading of photography does is challenge many of the assumptions that outsiders and insiders, scholars and lay people have about what it means to be German, let alone queer today, as well as in the past. It challenges the broad strokes acceptance of universal categories like identity and suggests the need for a more nuanced, intersectional, and often transnational ways of seeing and reading for the queer and trans past. The lessons we might learn from viewing the German past this way allows us to better see and understand race, sexuality, and gender presentation, as well as identity in the late 20th and 21st centuries. It is also an historical analysis of queer and trans lives and community, and a commentary on historical practice more broadly, an art of history, a way of doing things differently. Let me concretize where it sits in the German historiography and raise a few points about its other intellectual commitments, as there are other lessons as well around identity, citizenship, and democratic practice. I argue in the book that there is a triumphalist narrative within queer history of moving from illegality to full citizenship that has often been written as part of the success story of the Federal Republic of Germany. And it's, of course, a success story that is then mirrored in many parts of the West as well. Of course, legality was hard fought for and hard won. And as I hinted at earlier, at least the same number of people were jailed in post-war West Germany as during the Nazi period, some 50,000 strong, under the same Nazi version of the law that was on the books until 1969, and it's a slightly different case in East Germany. The story of liberalization, of successful integration, animates much of the thinking of mainstream queer organizations, like the LSVD, the largest queer organization in Germany. That with the building of the monument to persecuted homosexuals in Berlin in 2011, with official apologies for wrongdoing during the Third Reich and the post-war period, and the establishment of gay marriage in 2017, equal citizenship was achieved, the result of this long battle. This claim rests on several assumptions: that the experience of equality is equally felt and accessible to all, that challenges to equality are somehow external to the German state, and although this is currently undergoing considerable revision with the anti-trans movement taking hold in many parts of the West, queer and trans rights are often held up as the measure of liberal democracy, what Jasbir Puar has called homonationalism, for the way it often overlooks the tensions within states themselves, especially around race, but also around kink. In One-Dimensional Queer, Yale's Roderick Ferguson sees this as the watering down of an intrinsically radical movement into the single-issue topic of gay liberation. Instead of focusing on how liberationist discourses were always wrestling, not always successfully, with critiques of racial capitalism, decolonization, migration, and income inequality, to say nothing of other issues like gender presentation, as my book tries to show. The belief that legal equality somehow translates into social equality obfuscates fractures in the social contract, revealing something much more coercive. As Lisa Dugan has argued, it has created a kind of homonormativity, draining queerness of its radical force to disrupt norms and build new worlds. Instead of dreaming up new social formations, in her words, we have been administered a kind of political sedative. We get marriage and the military, then we go home and cook dinner forever. Just one example of this might be seen in the Homo Monument, as it's sometimes colloquially called. A great achievement formally acknowledging the persecution of gays and lesbians, though the inclusion of lesbians and trans people has been a very difficult and contested part of this story. The memorial plaque in front of the concrete cube in the Tiergarten gives the sense that homophobia is something that is experienced in other parts of the world, something foreign, no longer present in today's Germany. And given the discourse within the German and international queer press at the time, it's clear that this is meant to suggest the liberal West. This sentiment of the foreignness of homophobia was mirrored in the many organized kiss-ins that took place in front of the mosques in the early 1990s and so-called migrant neighborhoods into the early 2000s. when a wave of street altercations put migrant communities under the microscope, while homegrown homophobia was never a focus of concern. In other words, the media, state, and society approach to gay inequality has within it a history of racism that needs unpacking. And you can see it in I tried to blow it up here. This is from the very bottom part of the memorial. Because of its history, Germany has a special responsibility to actively oppose the violation of gay men's and lesbians' human rights. In many parts of the world, people continue to be persecuted for their sexuality. Homosexual love remains illegal, and a kiss can be dangerous. So there's a kiss film that's featured, and anybody who's gone to Berlin has seen this. The memorial is just basically a big gray slab with a little cutout, sort of like a glory hole, meant to look like that, a much bigger glory hole. And in it is a film with two men kissing, two women kissing, and this was a huge and massive debate, but it's interesting and significant that this fixation with the kiss is also happening at a time when there are these kiss-ins organized by the largest queer community activist group. Another part of the historiography is the focus almost exclusively on gay male experience. And there are reasons for this. Mostly because people who wrote the story of legal persecution followed the anti-sodomy paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, and they saw that as the burning issue. In fact, it has been challenging to incorporate lesbian and trans experience into the public memory of queer persecution, and the pushback has been immense, not just from outside, but from within the community itself. The editor of the leftist Taz newspaper, Jan Federsen, went so far as to label folks who called for a broader intersectional history of queer life proponents of a kind of queer Gita, a reference to the right-leaning populist citizens' initiatives that held weekly marches against migration in Dresden. Others, like Alexander Zinn, who was part of the commission to have the memorial built in the first place and now works at the Fritz Bauer Institute, named for the Jewish, German, and gay jurist who helped bring Adolf Eichmann to trial, and whose name dawns a human rights organization. Alexander Zinn has opposed all efforts to include lesbians, and now he extends this to trans persons. He somehow even managed to publish an op-ed last year in Germany's paper of record, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung's editorial section, suggesting that academic feminists and proponents of queer theory are almost as bad as those in Muslim countries who would throw his kind off of the rooftops. So there's this strange way that some well-positioned gay men now argue that trans persons, academic feminists, and scholars of intersectional queer history are imperiling the project of universal equality for shining a light on the politics of race and class and gender in the movement. If this is the political center and not the radical right, it bears asking, how on earth did we get here? And what does this tension between perceived universalism and the blind spots to power and identity tell us about queer and trans life in the past as well as today? In drawing lessons from Germany, my book tries to question this disconnect. On the one hand, how aspects of the queer past have been drawn upon to make a series of claims about liberal democracy and the place of identity in rights-based discourses of experience, policy, and governance, while at the same time used as a cudgel against those who would argue there is a rich, complex, intersectional past, provided we just look for it. I suggest that in centering a triumphalist historical narrative based around discrimination and the attainment of key social rights, following Wendy Brown and Jose Munoz on the tensions within universal categories themselves, legal equality has come on the back of a kind of race-blind, gender-conformist identity politics that flies in the face not just of inequalities within the various scenes around gender presentation, around race, around sexual desire, but by a kind of respectability politics that fails to appreciate histories of solidarity, of tension, of opposition, and of kinship across difference that also made up queer life after fascism. My boldest claim is to highlight that the challenge to queer and trans rights in today's Germany comes from the far right unmistakably, but it's aided ever increasingly by backsliding in the liberal center, which has come about through the de-radicalization of queer politics since the 1970s. Let me give you a few reasons for this. We've largely written our queer histories out of sexological and social movement discourses, which have reproduced a narrative of assimilation and respectability over parallel traditions of world-making that challenge sensibilities in fundamental ways. Lauren Stokes and Frank Bies, Tiffany Florville and Damani Partridge have shown that there were limits to citizenship in the Federal Republic of Germany, particularly around race, but also around forms of sexuality deemed outside the bounds of respectability, as might be seen in the antipathy of the West German homophile and gay liberation groups against cruising and anonymous sex, or conflicts between gender nonconforming Tunten, which is a kind of, again, a form of drag, in the working class gay liberation movement, or the disavowal of intergenerational sex in the scene, which results in a conflict between radical and more assimilationist tendencies within the movement. These more reformist factions include within them a hesitance to work across difference with lesbians and feminists, the demonization of effeminacy, and participation in the 1990s kiss-ins in front of mosques to demonstrate the power of Western values. It's one of the reasons why gay marriage looks a lot like heteronormative white middle-class family making. Joel Fisher at Yale and Tom Hooper at York University in Toronto make similar arguments in the US and Canada for the way pride events have begun to mobilize against kink and with the participation of the police and corporations, fundamentally altering the spirit of radical alterity. We've forgotten this history of conflict and solidarity, these alternative paths. They're not only forgotten, they are increasingly hard to imagine in the first place. Our histories, activists as well as scholarly, have adopted not only the teleology of liberalization, but also a narrow emphasis on identity, which has meant we are not able to see the history of collective mobilizations, of entangled lives, and moments of working together across difference that were likewise a part of the queer and trans past, whether that be the groups that frequented Ellie's beer bar in Kreuzberg, owned by a leather-clad former Nazi lesbian, it's always fun to say, and home to gay, trans, and street worker clientele who worked together during police raids to police the most vulnerable. Or like the homosexual interest group in East Berlin, which included male, female, and trans activists, and saw the mere act of socializing as an important tool of political opposition. And they held, by all accounts, drag performances and fancy dress parties and parades, which is hard to imagine in a totalitarian space. Or even feminists and lesbian separatists who mobilized together against abortion and the right-wing press. We often impose contemporary identity categories onto past lives that were lived much more fluidly than we are able to imagine. Using kinship as an analytical category, not as a synonym for the family, but in echoing Dene feminist and member of the Sisseton Wahhopen Oyate First Nation Kim Talbert's argument, as a form of relationality, the ties that bind our historical actors to each other and to the past and us to them, allows us new insight into the fraught ways in which Germans have confronted race, gender nonconformity, and sexuality in social movements, art, and everyday life. A cautionary tale against the triumphalist politics of remembering, while at the same time modeling a difference-based diversity that transcends silo identities. My book tells the story of entanglements and alliances as queer and trans people tested out new possibilities for life, love, public and family life in the 20th and 21st centuries. At the heart of this is what I call the queer art of history. That is a nudge for us to write more imaginatively, expansively, creatively, drawing on interdisciplinary methods for how we might read our sources, for how they create and construct entangled relationships of affinity, attachment, and community, forms of belonging in the past that condition how experience might be thought about in the future. This book does this by extending kinship to our own relationships to these histories. I'm very present in this text through acts of revision of my earlier arguments, the blind spots that I had when looking at this work. As a kind of queer kinship with the networks that are intellectual as well as affective, and maybe even erotic, as American poet Audre Lorde famously reflected, drawing on her own time in Berlin. She argued that through our own cultural production, we place ourselves in kinship with others as agents of change. The final chapter of my book explores how contemporary artists, filmmakers, and photographers enmesh themselves and us, the viewer audience, in these networks of trans, inclusive, queer history making, demonstrating the power of kinship as intellectual and emotional solidarity with a past that is not always our own, so as to imagine new futures together. So let me bring us back to this photo of Cheyenne by way of conclusion. As this photo shows, queer life after fascism was multifaceted and plurivocal, made up of diverse solidarities and associations that are often absent from the historical register, not because they didn't exist, but because a presumed universalism has failed to take into account inequalities within the very conceptualization of queer citizenship, aided by limits in how we think of and write this history itself. As the literary scholar Saidiya Hartman described already in 2003, cultural histories of power and liberation must do more than recount the desire for inclusion within the limited set of possibilities that the national project provides. What is necessary is a radical rethink of what emancipatory politics looks like and means when the language of freedom, choice, and right simply reinforces in a new register the essence of difference in the first place, transposed onto other citizens. The lessons I hope we might draw from Germany is that we need to rethink this history. We need to trouble it. We need to invite ourselves to imagine a much more richer, more equitable, and hopefully better future for all our queer and trans kin. Thank you.